Happy that you're all joining us today. Again, put your name in the chat. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have some incredible programming. Our Friday updates, we have people from all over the country. We have historians, we have authors. Oh, speaking of authors, by the way, I got my advanced copy of The Kingdom of Children by R.L. Stoller, who was actually one of our guests a couple months ago. He is amazing, RL. He's incredible, and this is a book about how of all the marginalized communities on earth, children are the most marginalized and the most victimized. So I definitely recommend it. He's a good guest of our show, and I'm sure Lindsay's probably already looking so she can put up the video from when he was here. Anyway, let me get back to this. Next Friday, you can join us for a conversation with Kate Cohen. She was actually just at the Freedom from Religion Foundation conference in Madison, Wisconsin. She is a Washington Post contributing columnist and author of the upcoming book, We of Little Faith, Why I Stopped Pretending to Believe, and Maybe You Should Too. So come on by for that. I think today is actually the last day that we are going to be talking about this guns and God obsession that so many evangelical extremists have. So I'm really, really happy today to be talking with our guest. First is Dr. Kaveh Najafi. He is a fellowship-trained trauma surgeon and surgical critical care intensivist. He is currently the chief of general surgery at HonorHealth Osborn, Scottsdale's Level 1 Trauma Center. His firsthand experience with the devastation caused by firearms gives him a unique perspective as a board member for Arizonans for Gun Safety. And we also have Dr. Marie Thearle. Dr. Thearle has been Thearle has been a leader in gun violence prevention advocacy for 4 years. She is a retired physician whose encore career is as an adjunct professor. Wow, to be so lucky to be in her classes. As a mother of 2 children and an educator, she is passionate about working to reduce the gun violence public health crisis. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Is there anything that I missed in your bio?
Not me.
Nope. Only thing is, I should just warn people that I am a biostatistician and have done clinical research, so data is my thing.
I love that. You know, it's funny because I had no idea that in my graduating class of 1991, so many people from my high school would become like experts on science and data and like epidemiology, but like they are like Facebook certified, experts on things. It was truly amazing how many of my fellow graduates who were in very different classes that I was, are suddenly experts. So just joking. Sorry. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the both of you because I know that everybody is chomping at the bit to hear what you have to say. So go ahead, Dr. Thearle. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take 2 seconds and share my screen. Okay, so thank you for being here. So Kaveh and I kind of decided today that we were going to try to define the problem from a medical perspective by basically discussing some questions that we came up with. And then, of course, never really like to talk about this topic without providing some solutions. So I'll talk a little bit about some primary prevention, and then Kaveh is going to talk about his work doing teaching people about how to do secondary prevention. Okay, so I am going to pose this question to Kaveh and then let him talk. So Kaveh, in your viewpoint, as a trauma surgeon on the ground dealing with this weekly, how is gun violence prevention a medical issue for you?
Well, thank you for having me and letting me participate with this. This is an important subject for me. Because of the work that we do, and then also because I have little kids, and so it's important. So why do I think that gun violence is important, especially from the medical field? It's really from a public, I guess to start, you kind of have to look at the big picture and understand everything about the toll that gun violence takes on not just us, but our communities and society in general. I just think as physicians, we just don't talk about it enough. Um, we're not talking about the mental health aspects. We're not talking about the socioeconomic disadvantages. We're not talking about the violence in our communities. We're not talking about the suicides. And it's really become a public health epidemic. And so I know you mentioned before that you're a statistician. And so I think from a medical physician standpoint, if I just take the emotion out of it and all of that comes with it, and the electric charge that this topic has, if you just look at it from a public health a statistic standpoint, we're losing the battle. We're failing our kids. So, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but trauma or accidental injury is the leading cause of death for the age group from 1 to 24. For the past 60 years, that number one cause in that category has been motor vehicle accidents. Until about 2017, that motor vehicle accidents has now been replaced with firearm violence. And so if you just take that in, we can see that this is now, you can say that firearm injury and death due to firearms is the leading cause of death in the United States for the ages 1 to 24. And that's alarming. That's why it's important for the public health.
Right. So to back up what you just said, this is a graph from the New England Journal of Medicine that was published in 2022. And you can see here on the y-axis is the number of deaths in children and adolescents per 100,000. And then the years here on the x-axis. And you see firearms has been the death related to firearms has been pretty steady and increasing in the more recent years. But motor vehicle accidents, which were previously the leading cause of death, have decreased dramatically. That's really the thing. And that's because we don't have that emotion that you mentioned tied up in this. So there has been technological advances. There's been improved safety in cars. So we've made a real difference in improving deaths due to motor vehicle accidents, but we have not made those same, had those same benefits with firearm related deaths. And I will point out that when we say deaths by firearm, we're talking about homicide in about 60% of the cases, suicide in the other third, and then a small percentage are those unfortunate unintentional deaths that you hear about where like a 4-year-old finds a gun and shoots their sibling. Okay, so
And Marie, just to point out just for a second, right? Like, yeah. So if we're saying that we see this steep drop off in injuries from motor vehicle crashes, and so if you look into that and you like, why does that happen? We always want to know, like, well, what caused that? How did we get there? What was going on that helped us get better? And it's multifactorial, right? So it's just like you mentioned, it's safety in vehicles, but there's also a lot of focus on it from the government side of you, right? So there's National Institutes of Highway Safety that said, hey, listen, this is not acceptable. There's regulations, there's state regulations that are universal across the country. And then a lot of it relies now on the manufacturers, right? So we look to manufacturers, and of course they didn't want to spend more money with airbags and crumple zones and all of that stuff. But now if you go to buy a car, that's a selling point. Like, hey, look how safe our Volvo is. Look how safe this Toyota is, right? And so the opposite is what we're seeing in firearms. So you can ask yourself, well, what's causing that increase, right? So if we know that there's certain things that reduce risk and reduce death and injury, what causes increases in injury and death, and who's responsible for that? And so I think if you just take the emotion out of it and you look at it that way, there's very clear answers of what we need to be responsible for, especially as physicians championing this thing where this is what we deal with. We deal with injury, we deal with disease, and we deal with preventing disease, and that's our job. If all of a sudden we saw increases in plane crashes, right? Say it wasn't firearms, but say now all these people are dying in plane crashes, we would freak out. We say, well, where's the FAA? What is Delta doing? What is Southwest doing? Right? Why isn't that turning back onto us and the gun industry?
Right. I agree. And so I also agree that I think one of the reasons, primary reasons to pull out of what you said, that gun violence is a medical issue is because every one of these deaths is preventable for the most
So
part.
real quick, there is a question here, and I feel like the timing is right. Christine is asking, historically, there have been laws prohibiting the study of gun violence and related gun issues. Is this still true?
So yes and no. So the thing is they did, as Kaveh was kind of mentioning, the firearm related industries have sort of been in opposition to gun safety for a long time, and they definitely had the jump because they recognized that these deaths were occurring way before many of these gun safety groups started, even back in the 90s. So back in the 70s and 80s, they've stopped. They passed laws that said you could not study the effects of firearm related violence. Some of those laws have been loosened recently with the Biden administration. But I will tell you that researchers pretty much got around that by just being like, oh, we're studying all violence. And since most of the violence related deaths are firearms, it really didn't stop. To me, the bigger issue is that these same companies also, through their lobbying efforts, got laws passed that make it impossible to sue them, right? Because money talks. So, you burn yourself with McDonald's coffee, you can sue McDonald's. Your kid finds a gun and shoots somebody, their sibling, you can't sue them. Or if your child goes over to a sleepover and ends up getting shot because you didn't safely secure your gun, not only is the owner of that gun protected, but so is the firearm, the person who produced that firearm and created that firearm. Now, the Brady group has worked hard to try to figure out how to sue anyway, with mixed results, I would say. Yeah. So, okay. So speaking of that, so Kaveh, I think this is maybe more, this next question was something that I was wondering as somebody, so I do in the past did internal medicine. So I would have a number of patients who were in wheelchairs. Like I can think, for example, of a child who was shot by his cousin at the age of 16 and had gone from being sort of this sport, very athletic child, human, very bright future ahead of him, smart, to being a paraplegic and spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair and trying to navigate the disability that he had acquired. So I was wondering, for you, when you see these gunshot wounds on a regular basis, is there like a moral injury associated with that? Is there like a mental trauma that you've had to learn how to deal with?
That's a great question. So, when somebody comes in with a bad gunshot wound, it's all hands on deck. So there's the trauma team, there's the ER team, there's the OR team. It extends to all the nurses who are watching all this go on. It extends to even environmental services that have to clean up the room afterwards and see all this blood and bags everywhere. The toll that it takes is devastating. So, we use all the resources available, which means that sometimes we can empty out a whole blood bank on one person because of these gunshot wounds. And then, sorry, the fact that so many people have witnessed kind of this tragedy, folks take that with them. As much as we see it, or as much as we tell ourselves it's fine, or as much as we're like, this is what we signed up for, it's impossible not to separate it sometimes. And the second part of that is, once if you do everything possible and it just ends up that you weren't able to save this person, then I have to go and talk to mom or dad and tell them, we did everything possible, but I wasn't able to save your son. And yeah, there's a huge kind of drain on your system and kind of, personally. you kind of take it and kind of work on and move with it. But we often have debriefs after stuff like this, you know, so that people can voice their concerns and voice their opinions and kind of grieve a little bit. Some folks have to take time off, and we've also lost really good team members just because they didn't want to do it anymore. And that's the immediate that we see just on the medical team, but you're 100% correct. So even if someone gets shot and survives, you know, those long-term disabilities are everlasting, right? So that drain on the system continues, where it's you know, you get disability or they can't work anymore, or we have to provide different services for these things. So it's not just a one-time thing where it ends. So yeah, the toll is tremendous.
Right. So along those same lines, we're both parents. And I found, like, after I became a mother, some things were like I did not have the emotional capacity to do pediatrics after I became a mother. So how does being a parent and doing this work, how does it change how you look at your own children, how safe you feel when you send them off to school in the mornings after you've seen what, like, you know, because healthcare providers carry this burden with them of seeing what really happens.
Yeah, it's you know, my poor kids are bubble wrapped at all times. You know, they never get to ride bikes without helmets. They can't ride skateboards without helmets. They have to wear seatbelts everywhere. You know, it's just because it's for me, it's a reality. It's what I see every day. You know, it's everybody's worst day is my every day. And so these things happen, right? And nobody ever expects to come see me. They're never like, oh, I have an appointment with the trauma guy today at 10 o'clock while I'm driving to work. So it's terrifying. And the reason why it's terrifying is because I just look at the numbers, right? And I know that gun violence and firearm injury is increasing, and it's the number one killer of our children and adolescents and young adults. So it's all a numbers game, right? And so those numbers are not good. And so it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. I still send them to school, you know, I still try to educate, you know, friends and family and everyone that's associated with it. And then I think doing this kind of work, having these conversations, you know, with not just between like-minded folks, but everybody, you know, gun advocates and, you know, gun safety advocates. I think to move this forward, I think it takes everybody at the table to sit down and say, listen, look at this problem. What are we going to do about it?
Can I ask how, you know, because oftentimes I feel like on these Friday discussions, we're kind of in an echo chamber, right? We're all in our echo chambers because of social media. I want to know, like, how often do you have opportunities to talk to people who are gun advocates, you know, like, and how do those conversations go?
I can,
Sorry,
okay.
go ahead, Marie.
So I'll talk to anybody. So so in the past, like, one of my friend's favorite pictures is me having a conversation with somebody who has a vest where the whole entire back that I cannot see is completely covered in NRA stickers or patches. But I will talk to anybody. And so because I teach at the community colleges, I teach at GCC and PVCC. And I'm just the kind of person who talks to my students. So I've had a lot of conversations with young men. They don't know the work that I do, but, like, we've had a lot of these conversations, talking and thinking about this. So, like, not just people who think about it a lot, but people who are maybe a little bit, like, enamored with guns sometimes. Okay, so how about you, Kaveh?
You know, the trauma world is intimately involved with the military. So a lot of the information that we get, a lot of the studies, a lot of the things that we do is involved with the military. Here at Oz, we have a military partnership, which means that before folks get deployed, they train with us, and then they get deployed. So at least they have some experience or some knowledge or some skill set that they can take with them when they're deployed. So gun advocacy is is just blatant where we are, even in a trauma center. It's just all around us. And I have some very good friends who own guns. I have family that owns guns. One of my partners is an avid hunter. And that's not what bothers me at all. Because when I sit and I have those conversations, I always have these conversations. I'm like, hey, I'm working with Arizonans for gun safety, or I'm on this webinar this time, and like, what would you guys think about this? Like, here's the data. We're all very smart people. Like, what do you think we can do to move forward and do these things? So it's this constant input, because I think if you just have one side versus the other side, I don't think you ever hear each other. So if you just say, listen, I don't care at all if you have a gun. It makes no difference to me. I do not study the Constitution. I don't care what it says, right? Like those arguments are not mine. My arguments are like, listen, we have this public health epidemic and it's now a crisis. And the worst part about it is that it's a preventable crisis. And so what are we fighting each other for? We're fighting each other for what? So that's where I come from. So when I sit and I have these gun advocate, discussions, I'm like, would it make sense to have maybe some safer gun laws? Do you think it'd be smart to maybe have a waiting period? Do you think people with psych pass should have weapons? Do you think people who are domestic violence, charged with domestic violence, should have access to firearms? Do you think it'd be smart to lock it up? Do you think it'd be smart to have, just like a driver's license, you have to pass the test and show that you're proficient? When you got your first gun, did your folks just say, here's a gun, figure it out? No, they took you to the range. They showed you how to load it, how to cock it. Don't aim it at people. Like, there should be things that are just simple to do, that could help us prevent violence.
Exactly. You can mostly find common ground.
It seems like a no-brainer. And somebody in the chat, Mary Ellen, says guns should be registered like cars, and also do mandatory training like care, pass test, insure the device, and thus may be able to sue the manufacturer and or parent of a violent child. And she says, thank you for this conversation. She also says, did not know about the half-mast flag flying as Biden asked for last week to recognize the deaths in Maine. Wish he had asked for red flag laws to be passed instead. So I'm going to give it back over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly cover to back up what we're saying, that this is a public health crisis. And again, the focus for me as a parent and for Kaveh is a little bit on the side of the not wanting kids to be shot. Like, I feel like that is an area where a lot of people can find common ground. We don't want kids to die. So what is the risk of gun violence for kids living in the US? As we already said, it's the leading cause of death in children in the US. How does that translate to Arizona? For Arizona, it is still the second leading cause of death, because we do still have very high rate of motor vehicle accidents. And what that turns out, how that boils down to actual numbers, is that about 90 kids die by guns every year in Arizona. And those are mostly homicides and suicides. And I really want to focus in on the suicide piece of that for a second, because suicide is the leading cause of death for young people. And by young people, I mean people aged 10 to 24 in America. And it is a real problem. So here in this graph, again, this is the number of deaths, and this is the years on the x-axis. And the navy line is homicide. And you see the homicide line kind of bounces up and down. This includes the time of the pandemic where there was a spike. It's come back down. But suicide rates in the last decade have steadily been increasing. So they are a leading cause. It's the third, like if you just take suicide all by itself, it's the third leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 24. And that is a real medical problem. And the problem is easy access to firearms, because we are not seeing the number of suicide-related deaths despite the same mental health issues in other countries. So in the United States, we have more guns than people. So I think this graph here, this graphic, which shows that the US population makes up about 4.5% of the world population, but we own 42% of the civilian owned guns. And access to a gun increases the risk of death by suicide threefold. So the issue here is that there will be suicide attempts, but suicide attempts by all other methods, over 90% of the victims survive. We do have a lot of medical expertise available to help people survive if they can get to the hospital. The problem is for gun suicides, the statistics are flipped. So suicide attempts by a gun, 90% end up in death because it's so final. There's just no opportunity for a second chance. Okay, and so I have a 14-year-old son. So this statistic is particularly bothersome to me because the people who are most affected are boys and young men. So boys and young men represent 9 out of 10 firearm suicide victims. And the rate of firearm suicide is more common in rural areas than in urban areas. So in Arizona, many of the gun deaths, this is not just children, this is everybody, are 2/3 are from firearm suicide. Who is most likely to kill themselves by suicide? It's actually a white male in a rural area of Arizona. And then, we also talk a lot about school shootings because the biggest headlines are always around children and guns and school shootings. And I want to point out this really goes towards responsible gun ownership. So the conversations Kaveh was mentioning having, where a lot of people do agree, like, okay, maybe we don't let kids get access to guns when they are young and have an undeveloped, don't have a fully developed brain. So when gunfire occurs on school grounds, the majority of the time, the shooter got their gun from their home or the home of a relative or friend. So there is actually US Secret Service, this is from the Trump administration, did an evaluation and found that in the majority of cases, the firearms that were used in school shootings came from the home of a parent or a close relative. And this includes Arizona. So this is a past case. I didn't want to do any of the more recent cases that we've seen this year. But in this example, a 14-year-old girl shot and killed her girlfriend. And how did she get the gun? She asked a male classmate to steal the gun for her from his father, saying she needed it for protection. And this is from the Arizona Public Health Association. This is an analysis they did that I would encourage. It's 130 pages, but it has very in-depth evaluation of gun violence in Arizona. But this graph really stood out to me. So this is school shootings in Arizona. These are deaths, injuries, and incidents of school shootings. And you can see the spike in all of them in recent years of deaths, which is in yellow, injuries in green, and events in blue. Here's the school shooting events in Arizona by the decade. And if you look at our recent decade, which is only a few years in, we've already set a record. So there have been more school shootings in the first 3 years of the present decade than any previous decade since the data has been recorded. That is concerning to me. So, Kaveh, when you go, I am unsharing. Okay. So when you go to like conferences or when you're training other trauma physicians, I've heard through the grapevine that trauma physicians will actually travel to the US to learn about gunshot wounds because they don't see it in their own countries. So how do gun violence rates compare to other countries, and how often do you take care of gun violence victims versus your trauma peers in other countries?
I mean, it's I know that I'm cheating a little bit because I know you have a graph coming up, but it's absurd. It's 100% absurd that as a as a high income country compared to other first world countries, the amount of gun violence that we see it's absurd. Right. So it's not even close. It's not even comparable. We don't even talk about it. So you're 100% right. Either they get, in other countries, they either get training by coming here and rotating with us or from the military, because that's what we do.
Right. And then I just want to point out, as a woman, that women in the US are 21 times more likely to die by firearm homicide than women in other high income countries, because guns are the preferred murder weapon of domestic abusers. So I just want to make sure that that fact is out there, and that we remember that access to guns is not great. Okay, so, or easy access to guns for people with mental health issues or who have a history of violence. Okay, let's clarify what I was saying. So how do you see the Hippocratic Oath, Kaveh, in terms of gun violence prevention? What is our responsibility here? Like, we're here having this conversation, but for your colleagues, what do you see is our responsibility as a group?
Sure. So when you take that oath, right, it's more symbolic than anything else. But if you ever really like look through it or read through it, it talks about doing what's best for your patient, not doing harm. And then a major part of it that sometimes doesn't get talked about is preventing death where you can, or preventing injury, preventing disease, wherever you can. And you commit to saying that, yes, I am embarking in this field so that I can help people and that I can prevent disease whenever I can. And so that's what this is. This is 100% preventable. And I think, you mentioned that gun access is a problem. I think it's multifaceted. I think that it's 100% access. I think it's 100% education. I think mental health in this country is just dismal. And I think that if you have these conversations with folks, especially who are gun advocates, and you said, listen, just the numbers show that I'm not even doing this for me or my children. I'm doing this to save your son from committing suicide, right? Our kids are now so different than when we grew up, with internet and social media. And, it used to just be at school. It's something like, oh, someone made fun of me. But now they're like 11 o'clock at night checking their TikToks or whatever, saying so-and-so didn't like what I had to say. Depression and suicide is so prevalent now in our young population. And when you combine that with the ability to obtain firearms, and firearms that are far more effective at death than anything else, this is what we deal with. And so all those little things are preventable. And so as physicians, it's our responsibility to bring that up. We talk to, as pediatricians, talk to you about vaccines that kids need. They talk about car seats, they talk about helmets, they talk about what kind of dog do you have, right? I own a house and I put a pool in. I had to put a fence around my pool, not for my kids, but in case a neighbor jumped the fence and got into the pool. So, and that's fine by me, right? Like, that's, as a member of this society, to do things to prevent bad things from happening, I think is a responsibility for all of us. Primarily as physicians or those in the medical field, people look to us for advice. People look to us to speak up. So it's not really just something that's convenient. Like, just like you said, you don't have a problem talking to anybody. This comes up all the time for me, especially with patients that are there and that kind of stuff. But moreover, just talking out loud. Like, it just boggles my mind sometimes, these statistics and numbers, and why nobody is really kind of involved with this.
Right. So I find that there's definitely a contingent of physicians who are like, I'm not political, and they don't want to talk about it because they don't want, like, I'm going to generalize a little bit, but a lot of physicians want they want to be liked. And so there's a little bit of a fear out there of speaking up. But I personally think we have a responsibility to speak up and to try to make people understand that this, what you were saying earlier, like, we need to remove the emotion from it and look at it from a public health perspective. Okay, so if you had a wish list, what primary prevention solutions would you like to see enacted Like, so where do you think are some of the places we can make the biggest difference with prevention?
So I mean, of course, the discussion always comes to, securing weapons and securing firearms. Obviously, those are things that we can do. But what if you think, taking guns away from folks with, that we talked about earlier, with mental disabilities, or folks who have histories of psych issues, domestic violence, all those things, right? All those make sense. But we all know that, and we're still not doing it. So what if you also thought outside the box, right? So what if we had things for safety like smart guns, where everybody probably on this call and around the world has an iPhone, right? You can't open your iPhone anymore without looking at it. So what if you had some kind of technology where you can't access the weapon without a fingerprint, without an eye scan, a face scan, whatever it is, right? What if you made this available to gun manufacturers? So you're like, oh my gosh, all these gun violence advocates, all they want to do is take down the NRA and gun companies. I'm like, man, here's an opportunity for you to explode and like make way more money. Like, why not be Smith and Wesson, be the first people to be like, hey, we got a smart gun, we won't let your kids die. Like, would that not be a huge selling point? What about if you had stuff where the ammunition wasn't as deadly? Right. So when you're hunting, yes, you want different kinds of bullets, right, for gaming. But if you're using it at home for protection, why not use a rubber bullets? It obviously works for the police, right? They use rubber bullets and they're not lethal, and they definitely stop the intruder. So what if, gun companies got behind, what if we just made safer ammunition? So there's lots of different things outside the box. Obviously, from my standpoint, I look at it as a public health thing. We talked about that. And if you look at motor vehicle accidents, which are still prevalent, but not as deadly, it's multifactorial. It was the industry being a part of it. It was people expressing interest in it. And then it was the federal government stepping in and saying, this is not acceptable, fix this. And so if I had a wish list, it would be 100%, that it was a requirement to know how to use and store firearms would be the number one, because this is all preventable, and that would be by far the most impactful that I think. And then second, it would start to focus on kind of the mental health and the societal violence that we see.
So I have a quick question there, because it does seem to me, you want to be the leader on innovation, like I love the idea of like a fingerprint. Is the partnership with NRA, like, I mean, we all know how powerful the NRA lobby is, but like, would they risk then their affiliation with NRA? Like, why wouldn't you want to be on the cutting edge of technology when it comes to firearm safety? Why is this such a black and white issue? And again, is that partnership with the NRA so very important that nobody's thinking about this?
So there is a company that has made a smart gun that you open with a biometric lock, a fingerprint. I did not include a picture of it. I don't know why. But so the technology is available. We know it. We see it on our phones. So the question is, why aren't they doing it? Because they don't have to, right? So it costs extra money to add that in, even though, like, as a woman, many of you may know Pat Mace, who works in this space as well. So she always says, like, for women, are you being a gun owner or a gun donor? Because you can be overpowered and have your gun taken away from you. But if you have a biometric gun, like a smart gun, that can only be opened, the trigger can only be used with your fingerprint, then that gun can't be used against you. You know what I mean? Like, so I personally don't understand why, like, this isn't taking off, but I have had conversations with some of our Arizona legislators. Can we mandate this? Like, can we say that all new guns that are sold need to have this kind of technology on them? Now, to me, that would be on the top of my wish list, right? A little kid can't get a hold of it. If your kid takes it to school, they can't do anything with it. So that seems obvious, but it costs money, and I don't understand how it would impinge on our freedoms, but apparently if we tell anybody to do anything with their guns, sorry, I'm losing it. But you know what I mean? Like that, there's a certain group of people that don't want to be told anything, right? We've had spoken up at school board meetings and had people yell at us and say, no one's going to tell me what to do with my gun. So I'm just putting that out there, but I think this is a no-brainer to me. Like, we should have biometric guns. Okay, so I actually am gonna, is it okay if I share my screen again, Jeannie? Okay. Here we go. So that was it. Okay, so primary prevention, we're talking about intervening before people are hurt. And the whole point here is we want to say there are some solutions. So I'm just going to say that gun safety laws do work. So as an example, this is from a modeling study that was done where they looked at firearm homicide rates. And this is before Sandy Hook, I am going to say that, but Connecticut passed a background check law. And the comparison that was done was what happened in Connecticut in comparison with a model of a Connecticut where this gun law wasn't passed, where background check law wasn't passed, and compared to all control states. And it took a few years to take an effect. So this is a little bit about patience, that once these gun safety laws are passed, there is a waiting period where it takes a while for the state to see the full effect. So here, what they passed was called a permit to purchase law. So this is a way to ensure that everyone has a background check before obtaining the gun, whether they're buying it from the internet, from a neighbor, or from a registered business. And you see that the homicide rates decreased by 40%. Was this enough? No, because Sandy Hook happened in 2012. But that doesn't mean that we just give up. So this is a graph from an article in the journal Pediatrics, which is looking at all states. And basically what they found in this study is that the laws that are passed that improve gun safety, each one has a small effect, but those add up. So here on the x-axis, we have a gun law score. And then on the y-axis, it's the firearm-related mortality rate in kids, so how many kids die. And the stronger the gun law score, the less kids die. And one of the things that really stood out to me is that states with laws requiring universal background checks that had been in effect for 5 years had a decreased rate, had fewer children die by a third. So a third less children ended up dying because of those strong gun laws. So if you're wondering how Arizona is doing, we're not doing great. So we're in the list of national failures as defined by every town. We do not have strong gun safety laws. And that translates into real numbers. So on this side, this figure here, again from the Arizona Public Health Association, is telling you what the risk of death is for the citizens living in each state. So for example, here's Arizona in orange. So for Arizona, 1 out of every 81 people living in Arizona will be killed with a firearm, averaged out over all of our lifetime. But in a state like Massachusetts, which has stronger gun laws, the risk is reduced to 1 out of 351 people will die from a fire because of a gun-related death. And just as an FYI, that is why my child is going to college in Massachusetts. Okay. So over the last 2 decades, Arizona, indicated here in red, has actually been working to weaken gun safety instead of moving in the other direction, as some other states have, like Connecticut, California, Maryland, and Massachusetts. So we don't need to be looking for ideas. There are a ton of laws that have been shown to work in other states. And for me, my wish list would start with the foundational laws, background checks, the permit to purchase, having stronger requirements for concealed carry permits, having those red flag laws, also known as extreme risk laws, that may have helped in the recent Maine shooting, and then secure storage. So this is what Kaveh was referring to earlier. Safe storage sounds boring, but it works. So people could put a cable lock in their gun. You can get biometric safes, which you can open and get your gun out within less than 30 seconds. I know because I've tested it. You can get that gun out very quickly from a biometric safe. And there's now smart guns. So there are evidence-based solutions out there. Okay, so because I know we're getting near the end of our time, and I really want to make sure that Kaveh gets to talk about the work that he does in schools about Stop the Bleed. So I have this question though for you, Kaveh, before we talk about that, which is, I asked some 21-year-old guys who are into hunting what they would ask you if they could. And what they wanted to ask were these questions, which is, so this is now secondary prevention, which is intervening after people get hurt. What's the survival rate for victims of gunshot wounds? And there are a lot of advances in medicine, but also in gun technology and how much damage a gun can do to a human body. So are medical advances able to keep up in terms of life-saving procedures? And then they also wanted to know if you were gonna carry around a safety kit in the back of your car, what you would recommend for people, for lay people, what would be in it. So I'm gonna put these questions out for you. See what you say to
Sure.
these guys.
What's the survival rate of somebody gets shot is 100% dependent on where they get shot, and then time to a facility where they can be taken care of. So if you have a penetrating injury that hits major vessels and you're hunting in the woods 45 minutes away by helicopter, that survival rate is pretty dismal. If you get shot, a couple blocks away from the hospital, your survival rate increases. But just to say, what's the survival rate from a gunshot wound? It 100% depends where you get shot. Do we get folks who, I looked at our own data, and this year so far, we've had 38 total gunshot wounds. 22 of those were from assault. 3 folks died. And then 16 were self-inflicted, but 10 of those 16 died. That evidence is, I also looked at last year, which we had 60 gunshot wounds, and that's just here in Old Town Scottsdale. So you may look at Scottsdale and be like, that place is not violent, but here you go. So last year we had 36 assaults with a firearm, and 3 people died. And then we had 24 self-inflicted wounds. And the number was higher for deaths in that one. So the answer is, if it's intentional, and we know that, right, if it's a suicide attempt, the rates are 90% higher of success rates than anything else. Do we still get those folks who are practicing and trying to put their guns in a holster and blow a hole in their foot or in the side of their leg? Happens all the time. I was just trying to clean my gun at 3 a.m. after having a couple beers and blew my finger off. So those gunshot wounds are going to do pretty good, but we see it all the time. Has medical advancements kept up with gun advancements? The answer is 100% no. So if you look at, again, I hate to keep going back to it, but I'm a numbers guy, and we do things by evidence-based. So if you look at the automobile industry, they have spent the past 2 decades making things safer. If you look at the firearm industry, it has actually gone the opposite way and making firearms more lethal. And so how do you keep up with that? How do I, if there's a single round, handgun, how do I keep up with that medically when you have a semi-automatic round that can fire off multiple rounds per second. I can't keep up with that. And so the tenets of trauma surgery and penetrating wounds has always stayed the same. Trying to find where the bleeding is, stop that bleeding, and resuscitation. So blood products and fluid and life-saving measures. What do I carry in my car? I actually already carry stuff in my car, is a tourniquet. Tourniquets are life-saving. It's been proven over and over. We've had great outreach with our fire or EMS and police now. And then Marie, you mentioned about Stop the Bleed. So Stop the Bleed is a program that was set up by the American College of Surgeons, who noticed that just kind of, for ACLS that we were talking about, like, so you see somebody have a heart attack, start chest compressions and call the ambulance. And that actually saved lives. So we started doing that for, and it doesn't just have to be gunshots. It could be anything. It could be saws. It could be car accidents. It could be motorcycle accidents. Anything you see, jump out and either, pack the wound, put some pressure on it. We say Boy Scout it. And you can take just some gauze or different cloth or whatever, and just pack the wound just to keep the wound from bleeding. And then put a tourniquet on. And everyone's worried, like, well, what about the tourniquet? What if I cause more damage? This, and that. You can leave a tourniquet on for 6 hours before anything bad happens, but you could save a life, right? And so I'd much rather have a tourniquet on with somebody come in and then I take it off and be like, it was fine. And so those are the kinds of things that I carry in my car are gauze, and I also have not just in my car, but in my wife's car, is tourniquets. And so just to add to that, we also started several years ago. We reached out to Scottsdale Unified School District. And so we took this program to the teachers there. And so then started providing schools with Stop the Bleed kits. And then we offered a Teach the Teachers class. So they themselves then became teachers of the Stop the Bleed class and could teach other kids, other teachers, other students, whatever it may be. And so we often joke in the trauma world that we are constantly trying to put ourselves out of business because we're trying to prevent trauma. And so we actually have a whole division now for outreach that literally goes around the state, teaching Stop the Bleed several times a month. And so if you're interested in it, let me know. We taught at Harley-Davidson, we teach at schools, we teach at nursing facilities, we teach at wherever you want to do it. And so it's just a chance for us trying to do our part and make things better.
If you don't mind, I'm just gonna run through, there is a question. Yes, J. Rob says, these rational arguments seem self-evident. I feel so powerless in this state and living these days in my country. And I'm so very with you, J. Rob. Mary Ellen has a question. The lead that may remain in their blood system, does it have effects?
Not usually. And those folks can still get x-rays and they can still get MRIs, and they don't usually go through, they don't go off through airport detectors. There's always the scene in the movies where you find the bullet and you drop it in a tin bucket and it's the cool thing. We usually don't go after them because you'll cause more damage trying to find it than you will just leaving it. And so for the most part, we leave the foreign bodies in there.
Wait, but I will say one thing to that question though. That for people who go to shooting ranges and shoot regularly, there is a real risk of lead exposure that can cause anemia.
Huh.
So there are very high lead rates in people who go to shooting ranges, especially indoor shooting ranges, on a regular basis.
Oh, wow. I never, it's such a great question, Mary Ellen. It's something that I hadn't really considered. Mars on Earth says, great presentation. I love infographics. I do too. I'm not a numbers person, so you putting it into these bar graphs and line graphs and pie graphs, it really, really helps. They say, thank you for letting all the data tell the story. This one comes from David. David is actually, he leads our Phoenix Atheist meetup group. And so if you're interested in learning more about them, I know that they have a meetup group and they do more social activities. But what David says is, what frustrates me is not the level of gun violence per se, but that such a significant number of the population have no consideration of or empathy for others who might be affected. And so these closed-minded individuals are not open even to examining the issues, much less addressing them. In fact, the increasing levels of gun violence only further convinces them that availability and access to guns should be broadened rather than restricted. Until the mindsets of these people can be changed, or the Second Amendment, I fear that we, in the US anyway, will never make progress to improving the situation, sorry to say. And here is where I'm going to say, this is the connection to evangelical extremists and guns, right? Because they, in some cases, they treat it like a buffet, right? The Bible. But in some cases, it doesn't matter what you do on this earth, right? It doesn't matter what I do for my entire life, as long as on my deathbed, I take Jesus into my heart or whatever. And so it's very interesting to me, because I feel like, David, this is about them not really caring about what happens to people in this life, despite the teachings of their Savior, and instead focusing on like, well, it doesn't matter. At the same time, though, these are the same folks who will say, you can't have an abortion, and they put all these other restrictions on people. You can't have gender affirming health care, but I can do whatever I want to because this is my life, and whatever. So that's me on my soapbox. And if you want to address what David said, either of you, please go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, I would say, that's why if you have the information, you keep having those conversations, you just take the emotion out of it, right? You can't fight emotion with emotion. It just kind of builds on each other. But if you just literally say, just keep having that conversation and be like, yes, but I'm not doing it to take your guns away. I don't care what you do with your guns. I believe in the Constitution, but I'm not arguing about the Constitution. I'm saying that it's prevalent that firearms are killing children. Wouldn't you think that we should do something about that? And so just keep having those conversations and eventually ask them what's important to them. So when I have gun advocates that are very passionate, I just say, well, why? Well, why? Well, tell me why. Well, tell me why. Well, why do you want that? Why is this so important? Like, tell me, make me understand why it's so important. And then eventually it goes away. So like, I don't know why. And so if you just keep having those conversations and you keep moving forward and you keep talking about the issue, I think you're going to make headway.
I would also say, though, that I think there's a certain personality that is attracted to both, can I say, cult-like aspect of some of the evangelical groups that also lends themselves to the cult-like aspect of what I would call gun worship. So for those people, I don't think it's worth having the conversations with. Like, I've had conversations where like, we can agree that like 12-year-olds shouldn't own and carry a gun, right? And the guy was like, no, I think all 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds should have guns. And I was like, okay, we're done here. Like, there's no point. But I think what Kaveh's talking about is that the majority of people, you can find common ground, you can find an area where people can agree, okay, can we at least work to save the lives of kids?
I mean, yeah, just thinking about, she was in the news recently again, but Candace Taylor, who was like a gubernatorial candidate in, I don't remember where, but her campaign slogan was literally Jesus, guns, babies. And as an educator, this is where I find grammar to be really important and the use of commas, because but it shows where her priorities are, and her interpretation of the Christ figure is completely off. While Christ may have stood up for a whole bunch of things and turned the tables and the money changers and all that kind of stuff, I guarantee he wouldn't have been about arming people in our public schools. And I'm gonna go ahead and get on my soapbox for just a hot second here, because somebody posted a message in some Facebook group that I'm in today about micro schools. I'm new to the area and I'm curious about micro schools. And I was like, they could have unlocked guns. They could have a creepy uncle living with them who is a registered sex offender. They don't have to have gates around their pools. They don't have to have locks on their cabinets where they keep their cleaning supplies. And so it's just another place where I just feel like we need to have more scrutiny on the oversight of what is happening in these groups. And again, I know this isn't about education, but the fact that we are all thinking as parents, both of you, Dr. Najafi and Dr. Thearle, we think about that when we send our kids off to school. My daughter is a baby teacher. And while I was incredibly proud of the fact that she's following in my footsteps, the second thought that I had was, oh my God, I hope that nothing happens to her at the middle school where she teaches.
Yeah.
And so with that, because we are at 102, and I feel like we could probably go on for hours. And I just appreciate both of you and the work that you do every single day, and how much it must tax you both. These Friday discussions sometimes can be a little bit bleak, and especially when we're talking about gun violence in light of what happened last month in Lewiston, Maine. Like, what is the thing that keeps you going, gives you hope, inspires you? Give us some hope so that our weekend isn't like just all of us drowning in a bottle of wine.
Maria, I'll let you go first.
Okay, so first of all, I always have hope. Otherwise, what's the point, right? So I do think having these conversations is useful because it also helps us to realize that we can keep going. I actually think the graph that I showed with the states is hopeful, because you look at some place like Massachusetts, they have made a significant difference. They have reduced death rates from like 1 in 81 in Arizona to 1 in 350. That's a big difference. So there are solutions, there are things we can do. Do I like having to wait from election to election? No, but I feel like we have to eventually switch things over in the Arizona legislature, and then maybe we can really see the difference. I had, like, for example, the conversation I had about smart guns, which was with Senator Christine Marsh. She would be fully on board with putting out a law that asks that new guns that are sold in Arizona have some of this technology. I've had conversations with Representative Stacey Travers that should we have better training? Like, should we return to the days when Arizona had 40 hours of training requirements before you can have a concealed weapon permit? So there are good people at the Arizona legislature with smart ideas. We just need to give them the majority they need to pass some of those laws. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and for you, Dr. Najafi, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that the good news is that there's answers, right? So we know that this is preventable. We know what we need to do. It's stuff like this. It's having like-minded folks. It's empowering each other with information so that when you have that conversation next time with that next person, be like, yes, but listen, what about this? Right? It's that opportunity that we get each time to interact with somebody. And you can either shut down and just hold it to yourself and be pissed, or you can just kind of reach out and go, hey, listen, we're all in this together. Why not make it better? There's solutions to this. And so the thing that makes me hopeful is that there's an answer, right? It's not this mysterious box that I can't explain why people are dying. There's clear indications of what we need to do and what to change. And so that gives me hope. And I would love to be out of business.
Wouldn't we all? My goodness. Okay, Deb says, how can I access some of this information? I have a team that consistently write LTEs and would love to have these numbers to make our point. Will you be able to share this presentation for folks, especially, again, the data and the graphics are really good. Oh, good. Look, there it is. Dr. Thearle put it right in there. You've got it. So click that link, because again, we're 5 minutes over our time. And again, I think y'all have your homework assignment, and that is to find a common sense gun candidate or elected official who's already doing the work and put your full weight behind them. We are a nonpartisan organization. We do not endorse candidates, but we can certainly get behind issues. And if the issue is to make sure that our teachers, our public school staff, our children, and our communities are safer, that's an issue that all of us can get behind. And I mean, honestly, both of you, Dr. Thearle and Dr. Najafi, I can't express enough gratitude for you all and the work that you do every day to make our communities safer. I can't imagine the demons that you have to wrestle with, no pun intended, because I don't believe in demons, but I cannot imagine that the demons that you have to wrestle with after doing the jobs that you both do. So thank you for showing up every day, and let's put these folks out of business, y'all, right?
That's right. I would love to sell tacos on a beach and not do this. So
Same.
no, thank you, JD, for having us on and giving us a platform just to discuss and kind of talk about it from a different point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you. Have a
Okay,
great weekend,
cool.
everybody.
Bye, guys.
Take care.
Thank
All
you.
right.